Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Troy Clayton, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Wing Commander Ryan Kell. We warmly welcome the family of Corporal Donald Palmer, whose story will be told shortly. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Return and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Club Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. With golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is got by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Thank you. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Corporal Donald Palmer. Donald Palmer was born in Melbourne on the 3rd of August 1906, the youngest of 7 children born to commercial traveller Henry Palmer and his wife Eliza. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Donald was working as a motor mechanic and living in the Melbourne suburb of Elstonwick. In December that year, he married Maida Edna Bailey at St Cuthbert's Presbyterian Church in Brighton. Donald and his wife had been married for about 6 months when he enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 20th of June 1940. He began basic training in Melbourne before being allocated to the newly raised 2nd 10th Field Company, part of the Royal Australian Engineers, in July. Private Palmer undertook further training near Bonegilla before travelling to Sydney, where he embarked for active service in February 1941. Arriving in Singapore, Palmer was promoted to corporal. His unit remained at Malacca until August 1941, when they moved to Mersing to support the 8th Division in the defence of eastern Johor. With the increasing likelihood of Japan's entry into the war, the men of the 2nd 10th devoted their time to preparing defensive positions and roads, water supply and troop accommodation. In December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and Japanese forces began their land invasion of Malaya. Their advance was rapid and unstoppable, and in January 1942, the 2nd 10th Field Company joined other Allied units forced to fall back towards Singapore. The retreat from Johor forced a withdrawal from Mersing, and the 2nd 10th Field Company carried out a program of staged demolition to hinder the Japanese advance. By the end of the month, Allied forces had fallen back to Singapore, where the garrison found themselves isolated. As the enemy continued a string of sweeping victories across Malaya, Palmer's unit was tasked with defending the northwest section around Ama Keng, where it constructed forward defences. Palmer and the 2nd 10th found itself in the thick of the invasion when Japanese forces landed on the 8th and 9th of February 1942. The men worked desperately to construct further defences until they were forced to take up arms and fight as infantry. Palmer's unit had little hope of stopping the enemy's advance. Though the men fought hard against their attackers, their lines were quickly infiltrated, leading to confused and scattered fighting in the dark. Unable to halt the Japanese forces, Allied units were forced to continue their retreat, which ended with surrender on the outskirts of Singapore City on the 15th of February 1942. More than 130,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war, and among their number was Corporal Donald Palmer. Palmer and his comrades were imprisoned at Changi Camp. In May 1942, the Japanese began sending work parties to different locations to complete major building projects. Corporal Palmer was called up as part of B Force in July and was sent to Borneo to help construct a new Japanese airstrip. The men of B Force arrived in Borneo on the 18th of July and began establishing a new camp at Sandakan. Initially, conditions were unreasonable. Over time, the men were subject to beatings and torture, as well as starvation when their rations were reduced. Tropical disease, unsanitary living conditions, and malnourishment rapidly took their toll among men who were already overworked and exhausted. Palmer and his comrades remained at camp in Sandakan through 1943, living under worsening conditions. By 1944, Allied forces began closing in on Borneo, and in January 1945, fearful of an Allied invasion, the Japanese began preparations to move the remaining prisoners. In several groups, the men were made to undertake a series of marches to the town of Ranau, a march of some 260 kilometres west of Sandakan. The prisoners, weakened by disease and malnourishment, were forced to make their way through the dense jungle and rugged countryside under the watch of merciless Japanese guards. None of the prisoners were fit for the journey, and more than half of them did not have boots. Many of the prisoners collapsed en route, dying of exhaustion or being executed by their captors. Palmer was in the third group of the first march, which set out on the 31st of January. By the 11th of February, they'd made it to the food dump near Boto, where they found 6 cucumbers and a tiny amount of rice, which would be shared by around 50 men. They marched on in a zombie-like trance, crawling up the steeper paths until some could go no further. The mountain at Tavio, Malulu, just beyond the Tepang River, was the end of several, including Palmer. According to Keith Bottrell, one of the few survivors, Palmer and another man, Noakes, were shot by the Japanese guards on the morning of 13th of February 1945. Their bodies were never recovered. Donald Palmer was 38 years old. His name is listed on the roll of honour on my left among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Corporal Donald Palmer, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age will not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We'll remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub of Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.